Namaste, everyone. My name is Neha Kunte Patodekar. I warmly welcome you all to the second SETU talk organized by SETU and supported by Hindu Council of Australia on the topic Decolonizing Intellectual Minds of Indian Diaspora by Shree Sandeep Balakrishna. As the is being hosted in Australia, as per Australian custom, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of this land on which we meet today. I would like to also pay my respects to elders past and present. Indian diaspora is quite widespread and vibrant in Australia, and in today's audience, we have people from organizations like SETU, HCA, HSS, and other social groups such as Kutumba, that is Parivar Prabodhan, spiritual studies groups like Swadhyaya Astitvacha, and intellectuals from various fields. Before we begin the session, here are some etiquettes and program details. Please ensure you stay on mute and keep your videos on during the session. While the session is on, you can post your questions in the chat, which we will take up in the dedicated question and answer session which is followed by the lecture. You can also ask questions during the Q&A session by using the raise hand feature of Zoom. The program structure is as such. We shall begin with an introduction to SETU by Poonamji, followed by introduction to speaker by Sri Parag Gaikwad. Then we'll begin the main talk by Sri Sandeep Balakrishna. This will be followed by a question and answer session by Paragji again. We will conclude with a vote of thanks by Sri Abhijit Bhideji. I now invite Poonamji to introduce SETU. Dhanyavad.
Thank you, Nehaji, for the warm welcome. And hello to everyone. So I will quickly introduce about SETU as an organization. And SETU, the full form of SETU is Socio-Eternal Thinking for Unity. I'll repeat that. It's Socio-Eternal Thinking for Unity. So SETU started in 2020 and is a platform created to connect academia, business leaders, intellectuals, and young professionals in Australia and Bharat to promote dialogue in technology, science, and research, to explore opportunities and establish close ties between the two countries, which can together influence and shape the global discourse and true narratives. In spite of the lockdown in 2020 and partially in 2021, we have been able to reach out to the Indian and Australian diaspora through more than 10 various online events. We had organized our first in-person event, Women in STEM as Trailblazers and Changemakers in Melbourne in June 2023 for aspiring academia, which was an absolute success. SETU's guiding principles are: the world is one family, the truth is one and eternal, and knowledge can transform the heart and mind. SETU has two focus areas, Shiksha, which is education, and Vyapar, business and trade. With India's growing GDP rate and India being the fifth largest economy, SETU is planning to capitalize this and work with academia and business leaders in Australia to leverage Bharat's global influence and explore mutual opportunities in 2024. We are aiming to work with academicians and build the scholarship through the learnings in areas of technology, conducting exchange programs, interactions through research works in the field of science, energy, medical, and health sciences, businesses and startups between the two countries. This in turn will benefit significantly to the young students from Bharat who are taking up higher studies in Australia and young and dynamic entrepreneurs establishing the trade between the two countries. SETU is also a platform which promotes to build and voice the truth and positive narratives associated with any social issues, political issues, and matters of concerns to both the countries. Our aim is to build trust and bonding between opinion makers, intellectuals, and researchers in Australia and Bharat in shaping up the future and strengthening the ties between the two countries. On this note, I would like to let everyone know who is on this session to please subscribe on our SETU social media handle on Facebook, and reach out to us on email in case if you are interested in joining up for any scholarship opportunities or programs, and you want to take up that challenge. With this note, I would hand over to Paragji for the next part of the program. Dhanyavad.
Thanks a lot, Poonamji, for passing on the baton, and namaste to everyone. It's an honor for me that I have been given an opportunity to introduce Sri Sandeep Balakrishna ji today. For this, I'm very grateful to Sri Abhijit Bide. Sri Sandeep Balakrishna is a renowned author, editor, columnist, public intellectual, and an independent researcher. He has been writing on Bharat and Sanatan Dharma for about 2 decades now. His articles are primarily based on Bharatiya civilization, culture, history, literature, biographies of eminent people, and the occasional commentary on contemporary issues, but definitely not limited to these topics. Sandeep ji is the chief editor and founder of the Dharma Dispatch. The Dharma Dispatch is a specialist and unique online platform offering rare, valuable, original, and in-depth content aimed at crafting and promoting a cultural narrative rooted in the Sanatana ethos. Since its inception in 2018, the Dharma Dispatch has been recognized as the premier publication for well-researched, detailed, and insightful coverage on a range of topics. The focus of the Dharma Dispatch, akin to the core values of Sanatan Dharma, is both generational and civilizational. Sandeep ji is also a contributing editor in Preksha Journal, a niche online magazine focused on Bharatiya culture and philosophy. He holds a fellowship of the Indian Council for Philosophical Research. He has been interviewed on different YouTube channels like Kirti History, Abhijit Chawda, and Vad, where he has displayed an immense knowledge of our history and civilization in a most humble and calm manner. Sandeep ji has pursued his bachelor's in commerce and was working in the IT industry for more than 10 years. He portrays a perfect example of polymath and has been my source of inspiration for gaining knowledge in diversified subjects. Included amongst his literary works are the following intriguing titles: 10 Lessons from Hindu History in 10 Episodes, Tales of Grit, Heroism, and Valor, Invaders and Infidels, from Sindh to Delhi, the 500-year journey of Islamic invasions, 70 years of secularism, unpopular essays on the unofficial political religion of India, the Madurai Sultanate, a concise history, Tipu Sultan, the Tyrant of Mysore. He has also translated 2 books written by the legendary Kannada novelist Dr. S.L. Bhairappa from Kannada to English, namely Tabballiyu Neenade Mangi in English as often, Avarana the Veil. Without any further ado, I would like to hand over to Sri Sandeep ji. Thank you.
We can't hear you, Sandeep ji.
Yeah, I think you're on mute.
Okay. Am I audible now?
Yeah, you are.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
Namaste, and a very warm welcome to all of you. My heartfelt thanks goes out to Shri Abhijit Bide. He's been very persistent for several months. So owing to several personal commitments, I've been unable to make it to this platform earlier. So my apologies for that. And my heartfelt thanks also goes out to Shri Parag. That was a very generous introduction. So, kudos to all the good work that you are doing at SETU. So with that, I think we can, dive right into today's topic. And at the outset, this topic is so vast that it is really impossible to do justice to it, even in the space of, say, even 20 lectures. I'm not kidding. That this is the scope of this topic. The scale is vast and quite enormous. It is spread over a long, covers a long time span. So what I can do at best in this session is to offer some outlines on today's topic that will hopefully stimulate a wider and a deeper study. And I must say that within the limited scope of my own studies, till date, no comprehensive and institutional study of decolonization has been done with the seriousness that it merits. And almost every study related to decolonization, it has been done by a handful of passionate and dedicated individuals. And while their findings have been widely published, they have had little impact practically, considering the vastness of India's geography and the sheer scale of time that it has involved. And in fact, my own research in this area leads me to the following conclusion, that even after 3/4 of a century, Indians have actually become more colonized than they had ever been under British rule. I say this with great responsibility and a little bit of sadness as well. And we look at some of these aspects as we go along. And all attempts at decolonization in these 70 odd years after independence, they have been met with little success. And that success also has been at best sporadic and short-lived. Now, when we talk about decolonization, true decolonization, it actually reflects itself in lasting changes in the life and lifestyle of the individual, of the family, the community, the society, and last but not the least, political and administrative institutions. And I don't mean to sound alarmist or negative, but it is always better for us to face the bitter truth bluntly and with confidence if we honestly need to find such long-term solutions that, impact the whole nation and culture and civilization. So the first step in decolonization, therefore, involves this kind of all-encompassing study, and such a study will help us evolve practical and implementable solutions which will eventually decolonize us at all levels. And so from this perspective, decolonization is both an academic discipline and a practical process impacting our daily life as well. And as an academic discipline, it should guide the process, and the process in turn should enrich the discipline. It is also a mistake to think that decolonization is some kind of a specific goal to be achieved. Decolonization is actually a continuum. And at a very fundamental level, in the context of India, in the context of Hindu culture and civilization, decolonization is the recovery of memory. And in our case, it is a recovery of the Hindu civilizational and cultural memory spread across space and time. And so when we talk merely about, say, decolonizing the intellectual minds of the Indian diaspora, it confuses the forest for the trees. And I mean this in a very positive sense. Like I said, decolonization is an all-encompassing, a completely embracive phenomenon, which includes everything from politics to performing your daily puja at home. And regarding the specific area of the Indian Hindu diaspora, I have little knowledge because I have not lived abroad for any good length of time. And because, you are in Australia, I've lived in Sydney for about 3 years, and, and different durations of my life in US as well. So I don't have the kind of first-hand knowledge about the conditions facing the Indian Hindu diaspora out there. So in one sense, decolonization is a negative process which is aimed at achieving a positive outcome. It is much like rebuilding a destroyed building or structure. And even if the rebuilding is complete, it still won't be the original structure. Let's take a random example to illustrate this. Now, we have the rebuilding of the Grand Shree Ram Mandir in Ayodhya. This is a classic example. The new temple is definitely a civilizational victory. It is also a traditional, Hindu temple following the rules of the Shilpa Shastras and other architectural rules. But this new temple is not the original temple that Babur's general Mir Baqi destroyed. I mention this fact to emphasize the kind of challenges that decolonization involves, even in the physical space, even in something as a concrete structure like a temple. And so, to fully grasp the extent and complexity of this challenge, it is essentially to understand what led us to all of this. What led us to decolonization is colonization. So, in that respect, we need to answer some very, very basic questions. For example, how do we understand our own society today? What are the sources and tools and forms of knowledge that shape this understanding? Is our present Indian society or Hindu society, is it the same as what it was, say, even in 1970? If so, what are the common features? And if not, what are the key differences? And to answer these questions, we obviously need to turn to history. So one of the biggest obstacles of decolonization over this last 70 odd years is the distortion of history. We look at some of those aspects as well. So in other words, it is crucial for us to understand how and on what all planes, at what all levels that we have been colonized. And this understanding requires us to travel back to roughly about 250 years. And we need to study this history, and to understand the kind of forces that permanently changed India. And simultaneously, we also need to get a clear picture of how the Indian society had functioned back then. But sadly, the biggest difficulty in this process is that we no longer have access to that society. But in a summary, it is undeniable that the greatest damage has occurred at the level of our psyche, and this damage was deliberately was deliberately engineered. And in the space of this lecture, I can only give, a summary of the whole scene. Now, the clearest difference between an India before the advent of British colonization is in the realm of social engineering. Now, for the preceding 600 years before the British came in, before Europeans came in, the alien Muslim regimes had not tampered very much with our traditional and social institutions. Sure, they had done a lot of damage, but the continuity of these traditional Hindu institutions, social and other institutions, they had remained pretty much intact. Number two, Muslim invaders who came from outside India settled in India after establishing empires. However, from the beginning, the British knew that their stay in India would be temporary. And their own documents and records show how they were keenly aware that one day they would have to eventually pack up their bags and leave India. They hated everything about this country. They hated its climate. They hated its people. They hated their manners. They hated their food. They hated their customs. They hated their culture. They hated their society. While the oppression under Muslim kings was extremely crude, violent, and it evoked instant outrage from the Hindu population. But the British oppression was far more subtle at one level, but it was also long-term. And this had a single goal. It was to extort the maximum amount of wealth with maximum efficiency and effectiveness and speed. So guns and swords and weapons could take them only so far. This is something the British had realized in the early part of the 19th century. And so by the mid-19th century, the British initiated a generational project of social engineering. They brought in a new educational system which was entirely copied from their own native country, England, and they also introduced an alien legal framework. I'm just giving some major highlights out here. All of these measures were designed to serve the commercial interests of the East India Company initially, and later, after 1858, to serve the imperial interests of the British Crown. For example, the courts, law courts that we are all familiar with in India did not exist before the British came in. Long story short, by the second half of the 19th century, India was becoming transformed in an unprecedented fashion, and this transformation had an irreversible quality to it. Nowhere was a transformation more pronounced than in education, and I'm sure all of you here are familiar with the infamous Macaulay Minute on education, which was to create a class of Indians who would think like the British and blindly imitate them. But apart from education, the British also inflicted long-term and massive damage on our traditional institutions. For example, institutions of charity, community-based economics, the institution of business guilds, and so on. And all these changes naturally left a deep and lasting impact on Indians as a people and India as a civilization. And so in order to fully grasp this challenge of decolonization, we also need to understand the psychological impact of the kind of government that the British gave us. And like I said earlier, its fundamental aim was exploitation, and all the structures that the British erected were meant to serve this exploitation. And so education was transformed as a device to serve this exploitative administrative machinery. Laws were cooked up almost overnight to circumvent existing systems that were inconvenient to this exploitation. For the first time in India's long history, we had two separate countries within the same country. The first country was England, as represented by its colonial government, and the second country was the original India that England had colonized. This was a new development which pretty much cut off the India that had existed until then. And this phenomenon of having two countries within the same countries also gave birth to two societies within the same society. The first was a new English-educated Indian elite and the original Indians who stuck to their roots. And the former, that is the new British-educated Indian elite, was alienated from its own society. And like I said, at no point in our history did this situation exist. Just to give a couple of practical examples of how this worked. Until the British colonized us, a king or a chieftain or a rich zamindar, for example, he would tell a poor man, look, you can't build a bigger house than mine. But he never said that you cannot eat more than me. In other words, how much of historical amnesia we have gone through is that for all the abuse that the zamindari system received, a lot of it is true. There was a softer side to it, which meant that these zamindars had a running kitchen 24/7 in which anybody could come and eat food. So this is something no history textbook tells us. So in other words, despite economic differences, in economic status, religious belief, customs, food habits, and so on, there was an internal harmony between the ruling class and the subjects in India until the British came. This is also the reason, this internal harmony is also the reason why we never find a single mass revolution in the entire history of India when contrasted with Europe. When I say the entire history of India, I'm talking about a minimum of 7,000 years. So that begs the question, how was this internal harmony achieved? I'll read out two, quotes randomly by two great scholars of the previous century. The first is by Dr. S. Shree Shastri. He was a towering scholar of Indian history. He was also one of the first academics, mainstream academics, who actually told his students that the Aryan invasion theory was bogus. So this is what he says, and I quote, in the history of the world, it is only Hindu Dharma that gave not only to India, but also to all her neighbors an organic conception of society based upon economic as well as spiritual needs. It is a very antithesis of the principle of accumulation based on inequality, which is a vital part of the Western order of society. It recognized frankly the hard fact that perfect equality in all spheres is impossible to attain. Therefore, it attempted to mitigate the evil consequences of great disparity by aiming only at the essentials. It reconciled the antagonism between rights and obligations so that the individual, by asserting his inherent right, might not break up social solidarity, nor could society impose such obligations as to cripple the spirit of individualism. Liberty and law were synthesized to achieve spiritual freedom. Close quote. Now, the second quote is by another luminary named D.V. Gundappa. If you're familiar with my work on Dharma Dispatch, he figures prominently there. So he gives perhaps the clearest contrast between our traditional forms of government and the British or the European system of parliamentary democracy. And I quote, there has always been present in the body politic of England an element distrustful of authority and critical of its ways. We in this country never had, as the British had, a conflict between the king and his barons or bishops, and never a split in the citizen body as royalist and roundhead, Tory and Whig, conservative and liberal. There was no occasion for our ancestors to develop such a bifurcation of the public life. And then DVG says, our party life of today is an artificial creation. And this last line provides a vital key to the project of decolonization. When you look at this, it's very profound. There was no occasion for our ancestors to develop such a bifurcation of the public life, which is the ruling class and the class of the ruled. You see how all this neatly ties in with what I said just now about the internal harmony. Now, both Dr. Shrikanta Shastri and D.V. Gundappa, they wrote their work in the 1950s. And when D.V. Gundappa says that our party life, meaning political parties in India, our party life of today is an artificial creation, what he does is that he clearly points to the political impact of colonization even after India had attained political freedom. In other words, the harmony that had existed for millennia had been almost irreversibly shattered by British colonization. Now, let's keep this as a sort of backdrop and let's return to the 19th century once more. Even as the British were busy tampering with our institutions and establishing, their own model of education, a parallel development was occurring. And this development was the response to this social engineering, and it took two major forms. The first was the backlash that the Macaulayite education received. And it first began in Bengal, especially because Bengal was the first laboratory of the British colonization of the Indian mind. And when the Hindu society realized what the English education was doing, it hit back furiously. Mass campaigns were launched in the middle of the 19th century to discourage Indians from attending British schools, colleges, and universities. British educational institutions were branded in Bengal as Ghulam Khanas, or factories producing slaves for the British Empire. The second response forms one of the major pillars of today's lecture. This was a birth of what I call the modern Indian Renaissance. It is a unique epoch in our civilizational history. It is truly the golden age of modern India, and that period can be roughly traced to an entire century, from the second half of the 19th century to the second half of the 20th century. In fact, the Indian freedom struggle, which eventually became a mass political movement, it was only the political phase of a deeper and a far more profound struggle. This struggle was the struggle to recover the battered, bruised, and wounded ethos of the ancient Indian civilization, which had attracted the entire world continuously for more than 2000 years as the global hub of education and culture and wealth. Remember why Europeans came here and colonized us? For these reasons, primarily for wealth. And the same period, that is from the mid-19th century to about mid-20th century, this period also witnessed the birth of an entirely new class of extraordinary people. They were intellectuals, thinkers, philosophers, spiritual masters, writers, authors, artists, scholars, statesmen, and this period simultaneously transformed our business class as well. And this new class began to chart a completely new process and a new journey of re-evaluating and rediscovering its own roots using the tools introduced by Europeans, primarily the British. And gradually, as more and more Indians began traveling to Europe and other places, they got a first-hand experience of the society and other conditions out there, and they were able to make a comparative analysis with the Indian condition. One major finding was that the so-called modern scientific and British society of that period was, after all, not so progressive. It might surprise and shock you all to know that the 19th and the early 20th century British society was a deeply status-conscious society, and London, for example, was notorious for rampant teenage prostitution. So these are the same people, who developed the narrative that Indian society was nothing but a casteist and discriminatory society. So that's how it goes. And armed with these findings, this new class of the masters of Indian Renaissance, they began broadcasting these foreign truths to their own countrymen. And the result was nothing short of a comprehensive explosion of civilizational reawakening and cultural revival led by the brightest minds endowed with compassionate hearts that truly cared for Bharatavarsha. It might also be surprising today to learn that these luminaries of India were household names in their own time across Bharatavarsha. Unfortunately, we live in a celebrity culture, which worships all kinds of, film stars and fashion celebrities. But in those days, Indian society worshipped people like Jadunath Sarkar, for example, who was primarily a scholar of history, but he was also a household name because he was something far higher and profounder than being a mere historian. So in a nutshell, all these stalwarts were real luminaries in the sense that they exuded light, and it was a light which recultured the entire Indian society, both in parts and the whole. And So if we need to seek guidance and inspiration for decolonization in our own time, we definitely need to look towards these scholars. They were truly original minds who combined talent, scholarship, courage, selflessness, and virtuous conduct, who were also genuine patriots driven by a sense of purpose. Now, let me read out a brief list of names that I've selected at random. These are the heroes of the modern Indian Renaissance. Rajaram Mohan Roy, Swami Narayana, Debendranath Tagore, Swami Dayananda Saraswati, Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, Swami Vivekananda, Keshab Chandra Sen, Chattambi Swamikal, Sri Narayana Guru, Swami Vivekananda, Rabindranath Tagore, Mahatma Gandhi, Sri Aurobindo, Jagannath Sarkar, G.S. Sardesai, V.S. Rajwade, R. Narsimhachar, M. Hiriyanna, V.S. Agarwal, D.V. Gundappa, D.V. Pothdar, S. Sri Kantashastri, Govinda Pai, R.C. Majumdar, S. Krishnaswamy Iyengar, P.V. Kane, K. Neelakantashastri, P.K. Telang, U.N. Ghoshal, A.S. Altekar, C.S. Srinivasachari, V.V. Mirashi, B.S. Aletore, B.C. Law, R.D. Banerjee, Moti Chandra, D.C. Sarkar, Ramachandra Dikshitar, S. Shrikantaya, R.N. Saletore, G.S. Dikshit, C. Havadan Rao, Radhakumar Mukherjee. So that is 32 names. Remember that all these luminaries were spread across the length and breadth of India. And what is also common to all of them is a singular quality. They had a solid training and understanding of our tradition and our original learning. They had mastered both our traditional traditions and the new knowledge, that the West brought with it, and they could perfectly and confidently hold forth in any argument, both at home and with Europeans. They had also perfectly grasped the strengths and weaknesses of both systems and could clearly evaluate both with clarity and precision. Here are a couple of examples to illustrate this point. We can turn to D.V. Gundappa again, and this is really beautiful. In this, he delineates the fundamental difference between the Indian and the Western society. Quote, in chapter 6 of the Bhagavad Gita, two types of civilization are described, namely the Daivi or divine and Asuri or material. The civilization of the West is of the latter type, that is Asuri. If Socrates and Plato, Wordsworth and Carlyle, Goethe and Emerson represent that civilization, it is not very different from our own. But they are not its exponents. It has grown in spite of them. Their teachings have mostly been cries in the wilderness. Bigotry, intolerance, jealousy, competition, aggression, and selfishness are among the most salient features of the civilization of the West. Therefore, while assimilating it, we should beware of its evils. It has virtues as well: unanimity, cooperation for a common cause, public spirit, and resistance to unjust aggression. These are some of the qualities that we have yet to learn from the West. We have lost sight of our ancient ideals. Our Rama and Bhishma fall flat on our own ears. We have unlearned that love for everything our own, which formed such an important character of our ancestors. Therefore, our duty is to assimilate these virtues from the West if they can be found there, taking care not to mistake vices for virtues. Close quote. And the second is by U.C. Sarkar. He says, a certain class of Hindus were the peculiar products of Western civilization and Western education. They did not understand the underlying spirit or genius of the Hindu culture and religion, nor did they understand how to accept and assimilate what is best in a foreign culture and civilization. They were always attracted more by the exterior than by the intrinsic worth. It may be said that those who were really benefited by Western contact were never unwise enough to denounce their own cultural achievements and contributions. Close quote. So why I had to, give this rather lengthy backdrop is to show that these stalwarts of the new Indian Renaissance and their awesome legacy is still the best model for our present attempts at decolonization. And now we can briefly look at the term intellectual, since that forms a big part of today's discourse. Now, this term intellectual, or the latest fashion, they add one adjective to it. They call it public intellectual. This term intellectual, it is fairly recent, and it dates back roughly to the early 19th century. And perhaps its most influential founder was a Frenchman. His name was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. All of you know his name. And the growth of the phenomenon that he seeded, what became known as intellectualism, this phenomenon was an outcome of the medieval European society's revolt against the stranglehold of the church. And the British writer Paul Johnson, he gives a beautiful assessment of this class of intellectuals who first arose in Europe. And I quote, "With the decline of clerical power in the 18th century, a new kind of mentor emerged to fill the vacuum and capture the ear of society. He brought to this self-appointed task a far more radical approach than his clerical predecessors. He felt himself bound by no corpus. For the first time in human history, and with growing confidence and audacity, men arose to assert that they could diagnose the ills of society and cure them with their own unaided intellects. More, that they could devise formulae whereby not merely the structure of society, but the fundamental habits of human beings could be transformed for the better. Unlike their sacerdotal predecessors, they were not servants and interpreters of the God, but substitutes." Close quote. And we need to keep this. This is a very, very fundamental point. It helps to keep it in mind as we go along. So in this slide, what has been the Hindu experience or the Indian experience of intellectual tradition? And is it even an intellectual tradition in the sense that Paul Johnson and the European tradition understands it? So first, the Hindu tradition makes three clear distinctions. The first is the Adhibhuta, or the physical plane. The second is the Adhidaiva, which is the plane of the deity or gods and so on. And the third is the Adhyatma, which is the spiritual plane. And our intellectual tradition has well-defined logical rules for debating any topic. And one primary rule is that one cannot mix these three planes in any debate. I'll illustrate this with an example. Say you are analyzing the Ramayana on the Adhibhuta plane, that is, on the physical plane. So when you're analyzing the Ramayana on the physical plane, you can't bring in the Adhidaiva elements into that plane. Meaning you can't bring in the unseen or the godly elements onto that plane. And so on the Adhibhuta or the physical plane, Ramayana's characters become just normal human beings like you and me, and they must be interpreted as such. On the Adhidaiva plane, Rama becomes an avatara of Mahavishnu, Sita Ma becomes an avatara of Lakshmi, and so on. On the Adhyatma plane, Rama symbolizes the Parabrahman. And so you have to first state your premises in any such debate. That is, on which plane you are making your arguments about the Ramayana. But even worse, what has happened, how the whole atmosphere has become vitiated and misled. There's so much of confusion that there is a rampant use of bringing in Adhibhuta arguments to understand something as abstract and experiential as Vedanta. And this kind of fundamental confusion is at the root of much of the failure to confidently establish the Hindu position in any public discourse on any topic. And there is also a basic difference between the Western and Indian intellectual tradition, if it can be called such. The Western intellectual tradition developed as a result of a revolt against church hegemony. It totally rejected God and replaced God with materialism and many other theories that emerged from materialism, or by rejecting the Christian God. In our tradition, there was never an opposition to God, because we had harmonized the material with the spiritual, and we had elevated the spiritual to the philosophical or to the level of darshana. And each had their well-defined places. There was no mixture, there was no confusion. And we can understand this clearly with some examples from our philosophical history. India has always had a long tradition of emperors and kings and rulers who gave up everything and became sannyasis and brahmagnanis. This tradition has a history of a minimum 5,000 years from Janaka to the Chandela king Dhanga. So he ruled from what is today known as Khajuraho, Chandela, King Dhanga. So Dhanga, he lived a prosperous rule, and towards the end of it, he renounced his whole empire and went to Prayaga and spent the rest of his life in meditation. And one day he closed his eyes, walked into the rivers of the Triveni, waters of the Triveni Sangama, and chanting the name of Om Namo Bhagavate Rudraya, he gave up his body. In the West, you won't find a single king like Janaka. Forget Janaka. You won't find a single king like Dhanga who could engage directly with great rishis like Yajnavalkya in deep philosophical debates. So this is a fundamental. So you see how many fundamental differences and points of divergence we have between our tradition and the Western tradition. So when we talk about intellectual discourse, decolonization, and so on, this is where we need to begin at the fundamentals, because at the very core, India is a spiritual civilization rooted in darshana or revelation, not in the sense of Christian revelation, but rooted in darshana. There is no equivalent English word for darshana. So our tradition, our civilization is rooted in darshana, whereas spirituality, the word and the concept spirituality in the West has been defined explicitly through the Christian theological lens. And even before Christianity, in the West, philosophy in the Western tradition is defined as merely a love of knowledge, whereas out here, it is a darshana or a realization through direct perception, which cannot be taught through books or in a classroom. Now, take any intellectual school or school of thought in the West. It primarily operates in the areas of society and politics. Most, if not all, of these Western schools of thought or intellectual schools are characterized by two main features. The first is that they are individual-centric. For example, this is why, for example, we have the Aristotelian school, the Platonic school, the Kantian school, the Hegelian school, the Foucauldian school, and so on. And all these schools have flourished. They have remained popular as long as that individual who founded that school was alive. And after that, they became merely historical records and not unbroken living traditions. And the second feature is that all these Western philosophical or intellectual schools, they operate primarily in the realm of politics and society. And we see the exact opposite of this in India. Our rishis and saints did not found any schools. They gave us living traditions based on the realization of universal principles. Second, in our tradition, society and politics are just means to attain a more profound goal, a more lofty goal. Let's look at this with a short analogy. A thirsty man needs water, and what is required for water is a container or a utensil. And so the utensil, that container, acquires a value because of water. And likewise, our life in this world, or worldly life, acquires a value because it enables the attainment of a goal of reaching a higher world. And society and politics acquire value because of worldly life. This is the hierarchy. And all such insights arise from contemplating on a plane at a level higher and deeper than the mere intellect. It requires formal training, and it requires a specific code of individual practices and years and decades of persistence. I'll come to this point in a bit, but before that, I must mention two fundamental historical points related to India and its colonization. The West understood India primarily through a Christian and a materialist and sociological prism. The attitude of their understanding was that of a conqueror and not as honest participants, not as involved, participants. They merely studied and analyzed our culture and philosophy and traditions and society as archaeologists or excavators or museum curators, and they had no real emotional feel for it. We can, clarify this with a data point. Europeans discovered Sanskrit at the same time that India discovered English. And after 250 years, India has a thriving market for Indians writing in English. Now tell me, how many works in Sanskrit has Europe or America produced in the same period? But the sad part is that as Indians or Hindus, we have internalized the European or Western understanding of India, and we are using their own frameworks and methodology and arguments to understand and defend our own traditions, when there are clearly so many fundamental differences that cannot be bridged. You cannot play the game according to the rules that the opponent has set and hope to win it. Small wonder that Hindus over the last 60, 70 years have ended up losing ground repeatedly. Now, the second historical point relates to India's experience with alien invasions, alien regimes and so on. This dates back to nearly one entire millennium. We have been politically and socially oppressed. Our institutions, society, etc. has been tampered with. Yet, in that prolonged span of time, not even one alien philosophy or tradition has managed to influence our philosophical core even one bit. This is our greatest strength, which we have not realized till date, even after 3/4 of a century. And finally, decolonization cannot be taught merely through books and lectures or in classrooms, like I said. It is a comprehensive civilizational endeavor in which everybody should consciously participate. It is a function of the immediate and the larger cultural and social atmosphere that incubates and nurtures it. The stalwarts of our modern Renaissance that I mentioned, they lived in this ambience. They could achieve what they did because they had that larger social and cultural ambience. Professor M. Hiriyanda, for example, he had his early training in Shastras and Sanskrit language and literature, for example, in a proper traditional Gurukulam. His immediate surrounding was rich with a Hindu cultural ambience, and such an atmosphere, it silently but invisibly imbibes imbibes us with lifelong lessons, and these lessons are too subtle to be formally taught. A whole ecosystem works behind the scenes to create these kinds of stalwarts, and that ecosystem has pretty much disappeared even in India. And small wonder that we as a Hindu society are no longer able to produce such luminaries. Plus, there is an additional difficulty. Today, we live almost in an exclusively materialistic world, and American style capitalist materialism, especially, it has not spared any country on earth. The emphasis in such a system is a constant striving and a struggle and a race for wealth for its own sake. This also conditions the mind to view everything from this materialist lens, or at any rate, through the lens of hardcore utilitarianism. And even in the 70s, I'll give an example to contrast this. Even in the 1970s, we had a familiar phrase in public discourse. It was called cultivating leisure. What do we have today? Today we have either endless work or mindless entertainment, but not leisure. And leisure is a precondition for the sort of cultural decolonization that is needed today. And leisure births calmness, it births equanimity, it births a sense of slowing down the pace of life. It births any culture and gives it expression in different forms as art, music, dance, poetry, literature, and so on. In other words, the unbroken cultural and social continuity is both a necessary and a sufficient condition for any meaningful attempt at decolonization. So studying how it had worked practically in the past, we don't need to go too far, just the past 80 years or a century at most. Studying how it worked practically in the past and what lessons we can learn from it, looking back at our own childhood experiences, understanding how our previous generations lived, a conscious cultivation of the subtler aspects of life, and above all, reading our past masters, especially our literary and artistic heritage, that I think is perhaps the best guide for decolonization. And on that note, I once again express my heartfelt gratitude to Shri Abhijit Bide for inviting me to share a few thoughts on this topic. And my thanks also go out to all of you for giving me such a patient hearing. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Namaste.
Thanks a lot, Sandeep ji. I think this kind of knowledge, the connection of different realms and your research does require a big round of applause. So I would like to ask everyone can give a big round of applause. You can use the icon or anything, but that's fantastic. I mean, what an amazing session. And I'm sure our audience would agree that when I say that you have changed our perspective of looking towards history today and how colonized minds have been cursed to Sanatan Dharma and Bharatiya Sanskriti. We do have a couple of questions which are coming in from our audience. The first question is from Shri Abhijit ji. Very detailed explanation on such a difficult and vast topic. Sandeep ji, thank you so much. He asks that with so many scholars such as J. Sai Deepak, Vikram Sampath emerging as courageous scholars and researchers, talking openly about the truth in history and Indian civilization, how do you see the current political environment helping to develop the attitude and urge in younger generation to take up this quest?
No, see, here's the thing. You can't look to political leaders to develop or decolonize or look at cultural and social aspect. It's actually the other way around. Your country or civilization will produce exactly that kind of leadership or that quality of political leadership that is directly proportionate to how culturally rooted and strong you are.
Thanks a lot for answering that.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that, because that is something a very narrow perception that an individual has, that why we should do, करेगा तो सारा government ही करेगा. So ये जो narrative है, ये narrative fundamentally अगर उसको address किया, and we say that कि no, it is the individuals who will try to lift themselves through this process, then obviously the environment will help in building that sort of a echo chamber, if I may use that word.
Ecosystem, actually.
Ecosystem, yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
We'll move on to the second question, which is again from Abhijit Ji, and that is, what is your recommendation for Indian diaspora having lived in Western society, and where you would like them to start to make visible changes in thinking, attitude, assertiveness, and not continue to blindly follow Westerners?
No, I mean, it is, I'm not actually, like I said, I'm not qualified to, talk on this, because I don't have first-hand experience of, how Hindus are living there, what are the challenges, what conditions they work in. So it will be dishonest on my part to give these solutions. But in general, a sense of Hindu civilization has always been kept going, even in difficult times, by a sense of community. What you call as a Hindu society was a well-oiled and tightly knit network of communities in all spaces, in business, in culture, and in worship, in whatever area. It was organized around communities. Now that community feeling, as one, it's like this, like a beautiful garment which is knit by millions of threads. Now you start dismantling. How to dismantle the garment? You start pulling one thread, and then the rest will follow. Now that beautiful garment has come apart at the seams, not at the seams. It has, come apart strand by strand. So the first thing is to weave all these strands together and think first as Hindus. So how you do, what are the challenges there? I'm not, like I said, qualified enough to comment on that.
No, I think you're right in saying this, that typically wherever the Hindus and the Hindu society dominates a certain section of the society, it starts, building and developing themselves into the silos, and where that competitiveness between each other, rather than presenting that one as a cohesive, society, falls apart. But with the younger generation coming out of Bharat and understanding how important it is for us to, be a very self-assertive, or take a pride in what you are, or what is your original roots are, that change is slowly happening. So I just wanted to understand, because you have taken up this studies and research in at a different level. It would be worthwhile for us to know as to from where we can start with this mindset that yes, we need to know, we need to learn, and we need to acquire knowledge.
No, you have to think as Hindus, sir. That is the only thing. I can't teach you how to think as Hindus, huh?
Yeah, I think if I have to put Sandeep ji, namaskar, Mohan Yelishetty, fantastic talk. Again, I put a couple of questions which probably Parag ji will read out. But if I can intervene what Abhijit ji trying to say, is there a community of practice that we can create as a scholarship where such deep-rooted inquiry could happen, not only at an individual level, but as an institution, so we can build across the geographies. It's not only that people in the Bharat has to do this, but also people who can think creatively, think collectively. So, in fact, I was at a conference, Australia-India Leadership Dialogue, 2 days back. So impossible individually, but possible collectively. So that's a very strong message that perhaps has got a lot of bearing to what we are trying to ask here. Any thoughts?
No, here's the thing. So when Hindus become a significant demographic in the West abroad, one of the first things they do is to build a temple, no? So there you have, people who go visit temples. There you have a loose sense of community, which does not translate into, action or a meaningful unity elsewhere in other areas of human activity. So you look again, the classic case is this new caste thing in US. Why did this happen? Because you also export, when Indians, Hindus migrate to the West, over a period of time, they also export the worst elements of that are found out here. So, I don't have a magic wand, to suggest how you can bring about unity. That is something you all have to introspect. You guys live there. You can start your study groups and chairs and, form some academic or quasi-private academic bodies to bring your message together. But what is a goal? Even when you produce good literature or, do some kind of activism, whatever works in that environment, is it purpose-driven? What is the end objective that you want to achieve? And why does why do other communities, for example, it didn't take even 1 hour for the entire Jewish community in the United States and elsewhere to stand solidly behind Israel. See, the problem lies at both the level of individuals as well as, the splintered Hindu community as a whole.
Yep, agree. And my other question was, thank you. So, Paragji, are you going to ask my next question, or?
Oh, no, you can ask.
Yes, okay. My other question is, okay, now if we have to do any conscious efforts to make sure that, we pass on a reasonably good legacy to our next generations, okay, whatever happened, and at least, there's some amount of wisdom that is still captured. Some of the scholars that you alluded to, yes, they did fantastic job of documenting something that went wrong or something that went right in our civilizations. But going forward, is there any, do you think, according to you, any conscious decision from Government of India through Education Policy 2020, the new education policy, to again do this in a more institutional way rather than individualistic way?
No,
which, for example, people like you are doing on individual basis. That is really commendable. But is there a institutionalized approach towards this?
Well, I don't see any institutionalized approach working. That institutionalized approach would have worked if it had begun in, say, in the 1950s or even 1960s. Now that we have crossed the bus, there are no people, there are no individuals. Even if you want to set up these institutions, you will need a minimum of 2 generations to, build up scholars of that caliber from the scratch. That atmosphere of learning, that I alluded to, all those scholars, that ambience is no longer there. It's not there in India only.
Yeah.
Only a few islands of, in villages or somewhere, not even villages, but some small gurukuls, this kind of thing is there.
Yeah, I think that brings to...
There is a clear divide. Those who have traditional learning don't know, are not exposed to, or don't want to imbibe the Western method of education, or don't want to learn Western systems of knowledge. Yeah. Those who live in urban India, they don't want to learn this. How do you bridge this? Those stalwarts that I mentioned earlier, like I said, they are the best models. Where do you find people, sir? An institution is a building. Somebody has to run them, no?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't believe in sugarcoating things, but this is just the reality.
No, but that brings to another important thing. Again, recently, sorry, Abhijit ji and Parag ji.
No, please.
because it's very interesting, and I'm
Yes,
really
it is.
I'm really supercharged or turbocharged with Sandeepji's that fantastic scholarship. In fact, as you were speaking, I sent a text message to my good friend and your good friend, our common friend, Professor Gautam Senji, and who is in Bharat and taking a flight from Calcutta to Delhi now. So he said, pass on my regards to Sandeepji, who was my editor of India Facts. I think at some stage you worked with him. So recently I hosted a colleague from Rastram School of Public Administration. And Rastram School is where even Gautam Senji is also one of the trustees. And Sahil Agarwalji and Suresh Prabhuji is the chancellor. So they are trying to harvest some of this traditional wisdom and also link that to modern. It is like how do you transcend that traditional wisdom of centuries and millennia to the generations that are going to come. So did you had something to do with Rastram School at all, or are you aware of their work?
I've interacted with some of them, that's all.
Okay.
Okay, next question.
So I have one question. So all the methods that you just mentioned throughout the session, I would like to know what roles did movies and other form of media played in this propaganda?
They played a significant role, but the role must be measured in terms of the impact that they've had. And some of it has been extremely harmful.
Okay. I think, would you like to read the questions from question from Avantiji?
Sure.
Yeah. It's a question, third question. Oh, I think it's probably to me directly. I'll read out. At an individual home unit level, what we can do is review the celebrations of birthdays. It's individualistic and blowing out lights since not our tradition. Graduation ceremonies everywhere in Bharat are clergy-like. This needs to be decolonized. Number 3, max use of mother tongue to pass on culture values. What are your views on this? In fact, she has posted this comment and the questions to me, but might as well, Sandeepji, we can have your views on this.
No, all these, external ceremonies there, you're just looking at the manifestation of a deeper rot. Whether you adopt a European or a Christian graduation ceremony or not, it doesn't really matter. But what led to this is what matters.
Yeah.
For example, half the ingredients and vegetables that we use for cooking today in India, which we have taken for granted as Indian cuisine, all come from abroad. Only in India can you make a goju with pineapple.
Yeah, very true. Very true.
Okay, so it doesn't matter. We were able to assimilate it and own it, claim ownership over it, because culturally, socially, civilizationally, we were strong.
Yeah, true. There is one next question from Anupji. Paragji, do you want to write it? It is to everyone.
Sure. So I can see that one. Anupji has asked, current academic research works around the evidential research and experiments to replicate those. Is there any Bharati version to give an alternative to this method?
No, there is. I think the question is misplaced. Based on evidentiary thing. See, first we have to classify what you're talking about, the subject you're talking about. If you're talking about giving evidence to abstract Vedantic concepts, it is stupid actually. That methodology doesn't work like that. It doesn't apply to us, in the sphere of Vedanta. So this whole tendency of blindly using these Western, methodology that was developed by the West, blanket, into everything, that all forms of knowledge and all branches of knowledge that had their origins in India. It is unscientific and misleading and stupid and dangerous.
Yeah.
Clarifying that. Are there any more questions or?
I think the last question that has been directed to me by Shree Kekarji it's a comment which I will read out, and then following that is a question. Excellent analysis of what damage colonization has done to India and Indians over 200 years of invasion rule, and a rationale behind decolonization. The damage to Indians and Indian society has occurred over previous 600 years, brutal invasion and Muslim rule. Should we be aiming at Sanatan Vedic Dharma, code of conduct and ethics that is going beyond decolonization?
No, I really don't understand this question actually.
Kelkarji, are you there? In case, if you can probably elaborate.
Yes, yes, I am here. I'm happy to elaborate.
Yeah.
Okay.
So okay. You can ask the question, please.
Okay. Now, what I am aiming at is that decolonization is certainly required because of 200 years of what nasty things Western and British has done to India. There's no doubt about on social, economic, cultural, and every aspect. But then this damage hasn't started just 200 years ago when British came to India. This damage has started when these Muslim invaders came to India, and they started brutally ruling and ruthlessly corrupting Indian traditions or whatever rules and ethics and even warfares, everything. Should we be aiming at going beyond decolonization? That's going back to our basic roots of Sanatan Dharma. That's a question.
No, it kind of, there are multiple things that is getting mixed up here. First, regarding the impact of Islamic invasions. It was brutal, oppressive, all that is fine. But it did not change the Hindu society fundamentally. It did not take away the cultural and civilizational self-confidence within Hindus. And remember that a good chunk of Indian Muslims, they were forcibly converted. So to that extent, you had a bit of civilizational memory. That was not, strictly speaking, a colonization in the sense that we understand British colonization. The damage that British colonization did was more fundamental. It occurred at the level of our cultural self-confidence, at the level of psyche. That is the hardest to undo. Now, when you say you have to go back to your Vedic roots, you can't. All these things have a practical dimension to it. It can flourish only in a specific sort of a physical environment, a specific sort of a cultural ambience, and just the way people address each other. These are all, like I said, too complex and too subtle things which, cannot be just revived like that. And your Vedic roots and all that, they have to be reflected in your achara. Not everybody in Hindu society needs to kind of, when you talk to, at any point in time, you talk to the common man, the proverbial common man about Vedic achara, things like that, he would look at you strangely. It's not like that. There is a certain sort of, there's no one-size-fits-all approach is not possible. It never was a feature of our society.
No, I'm not pleading one size fit to all or following the 2000 or 5000 year ago, routine, because the environment had changed, as you have rightly explained that. See, the Ram Mandir, which is constructed, it's not the one which was there when the original Ayodhya Mandir was there, before that Babur destroyed that. Certainly, I understand and appreciate that point. But what I'm saying is that not all evils in Indian society, culture, or whatever is has entered. It's not just 200 years of
No, I
British
never
rule.
claimed that
It
all
is,
of these entered just 200 years ago. I have to cut you short here, sir. Sorry.
yes, oh, that's fine. Okay,
That
you
was
have got
never
a
my-
point. Okay.
No, it was never my claim. The point is, when the British came, after the Mughal rule was shattered, whatever, when the British came, India simply changed masters. What you're mistaking here is that the epochs are clear, that's all. The phenomenon called oppression has remained. The nature and the masters have changed, the rulers have changed, the skin color has changed.
I think the modus operandi was different of the Muslim invaders and rulers, while that was different of British. But then both of them have done equal damage, and just decolonizing, in my eyes, is not enough. We may have to go beyond that. But then you have got a point here. I accept. I close my comment.
Thank you.
There's one more last question I think we'll take.
Yeah, I have space for only one question.
Yeah, sure. So there was a good comment from Chinmayji. Current impact we are seeing could it be because we have accepted Indian culture only when it suits us, and when it comes to day-to-day life, we have accepted Western ways. Probably. The next question and the last question from Mohanji is: do you see overlap your scholarship with that of Dr. Shashi Tharoor, in that he is a big critic of British Raj and its plunder, destruction, loot, and massacre?
Shashi Tharoor, with due respect to his scholarship, he lacks intellectual integrity, and I'm surprised that the gentleman who asked this question even takes him seriously.
Okay. This was asked by Mohanji himself, but anyway, yes, probably I would agree with you what you just mentioned here. Yes, over to Parag. If there is anything else, then I think we have taken good amount of time Sandeep ji has spent. So over to you and Neha ji.
Thank you, Abhijit ji. There are no more questions. Then actually like to hand over the session to Abhijit ji, who is the co-founder of SETU, to give the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Yes, I think probably I will take few minutes to provide a background from where Sandeep ji started. I have been following with Sandeep ji for more than 6 months now, just to make sure that he actually help us to conduct one unit of graduate diploma in Hindu culture and studies, which was organized by HCA and GTU, to take up standing up for dharma. That was the unit, and it would have been excellent for us to listen to him through 13 lectures, but destiny was for something different, and actually we had a good opportunity to listen to him now. So thank you so much, Sandeep ji. I'm going to continue to have a dialogue and contact with you, because we at Hindu Council as well as in SETU would like to really associate with you, take your help and guidance, and see what best can be done for people in Australia. So thank you so much for sparing your time and spending really almost close to 2 hours with us. Thanks to the entire audience, which is a diverse audience from Hindu Council, from SETU, from HSS, and obviously the intellectuals which are in Australia and especially in Melbourne. Thanks to Nehaji, Paragji, and Poonamji, who are the younger volunteers of our organizations and who are trying to groom themselves into these kind of discourses, understanding the topics, going through that initially to prepare themselves. So thank you very much. And once again, thank you all for patiently listening to the scholastic studies by Sandeep ji. With this note, I think probably we'll close the session unless Rajiv ji, you would like to say something, because Rajiv ji also is our co-founder. He is Dr. Rajiv Padde, who is the professor at RMIT, along with Dr. Mohan Yellashetty ji, who actually asked a couple of questions. He is a professor at Monash University, and they're all my co-founders of SETU. So if anything is there.
No, thanks, Abhijit ji. No, I don't have any questions. Just have to thank Sandeep ji for such a fantastic presentation. And as Mohan ji and you all said, and we all heard, a lot of things we should be here in or overseas should take into account and see what else can be done, because as he said, it is individually or as a community or as a group, we have to do something here overseas, not we can expect something from India. So I think it is a challenge and we should be sitting together and thinking over it in the future. So Sandeep ji, thank you very much. Thanks for your time and your presentation. Thanks, Abhijit ji.
Thank you. Namaste. Thanks.
Namaste.